Aloha, everyone. Good afternoon from Hawaii. Good morning to those in Southeast Asia, and good evening to those on continental United States. I am Pia Arboleda, Interim Director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. Welcome to the CSEAS LuceSEA webinar series supported by the Henry Luce Foundation. This series connects scholars and practitioners from the United States and Southeast Asia, provides a platform to share knowledge and fosters new collaborations. Mahalo for joining today's webinar on environmental innovation and sustainability in Southeast Asia, which brings together a distinguished group of experts. Today's moderator is Dr. Brian Szuster, professor in Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. He is a member of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies Center and has worked on environmental management issues in Southeast Asia for over 25 years. His work focuses on aquaculture, coastal management, marine tourism, and environmental impact assessment. He was a Fulbright ASEAN research scholar based in Thailand in 2023 and has recently led training projects as part of the CSAAS LuceSEA initiative in Thailand, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. He also teaches a new undergraduate course on resource management in Southeast Asia, which was developed with the support of the LuceSEA project and is offered to students at the University of Hawaii. He received his PhD in geography from the University of Victoria, has over 30 refereed publications, and co-chaired the 8th International Congress on Coastal and Marine Tourism in Waikoloa, Hawaii. Dear friends, please welcome our moderator, Professor Brian Szuster. May we have an engaging and insightful discussion. Mahalo.
Okay, thank you, Pia, for that very kind introduction, and welcome to everyone to our webinar. Today, our webinar focuses on the relevance of community-driven resilience and initiatives in Southeast Asia. As many of us know, Southeast Asia is at the forefront of many innovative approaches to environmental sustainability, as the region is grappling with a number of complex challenges such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and resource scarcity. This webinar will explore how community-driven initiatives and collaborative regional efforts are driving environmental progress across the region. So the first thing I'd like to do now is to briefly introduce our speakers. And we have three very distinguished and interesting speakers in the webinar today. Our first speaker is Dr. Mohammed Alif Sahide, who is a professor at the Forestry faculty at the Universitas Hasanuddin. And he's also the head of Forest and Society Research Group at this institution. Dr. Sahide actively engages on forest education and networking in Southeast Asia, and he's part of the National Policy Committee, works across Southeast Asia on these issues. His research focuses on critical perspectives of international regimes, land use policy, commons and commoning, political ecology, community forestry, institutions, and bureaucratic politics in Southeast Asia. So a very broad and diverse range of topics that he's had experience with. He's also a research team member on over 20 collaborative projects supported by various international organizations and national research groups, looking at policy and planning. As the founding and chief editor of Forest and Society, Alif has been active in capacity building and writing workshops for young researchers across Southeast Asia. So Dr. Sahide will be going first in our webinar in his presentations. Our second presenter will be Mr. Enrique Nuñez, Jr., who is a senior advisor with Biodiversity and International Land Coalition. Ricky is a seasoned leader and environmental strategist with over 25 years of experience advancing conservation, climate resilience, and sustainable development across Southeast Asia. He's led a number of initiatives that integrate biodiversity conservation, climate action, and community resilience, all of which would bridge science, policy, and practice to drive transformative impact. For over 13 years, he's served as the country executive director of Conservation International in the Philippines, where he's led a number of national and regional programs focusing on protecting biodiversity and promoting nature-based solutions that strengthen governance. Under his leadership, CI Philippines successfully implemented large-scale conservation projects that built multi-sectoral alliances and mobilized funding to support Indigenous peoples and local communities safeguarding critical ecosystems. He's also represented Conservation International in the Coral Triangle initiatives on the coral seas, fisheries, and food security, and he's advocated for stronger regional cooperation on marine and coastal resilience. Our third presenter is Dr. Yingshan Lau, who's a research fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Dr. Lau also completed her doctoral studies at the National University of Singapore, and she's a geographer, social hydrologist, environmentalist curious about human-nature relations. Her talk is titled Centering Local Carbon Communities in Forest Carbon Governance, and will cover topics such as such as forests as both carbon sinks and lived environments, the concept of carbon rights, and enhancing carbon literacy in forests for climate adaptation. So those are our three speakers, and I think what we should do now is move straight on to having them talk instead of me. And we'll start with Dr. Sahide, who will start off our webinar with our first presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Brian, for introducing us. Let me share. Okay, yeah, I will present the title of the presentation is Navigating Social Forestry in Indonesia, Policy and Resistance and Innovation. So, yeah, as we know that more than 50% people are urban, but close to 1.6 billion people in the world depend on the forest for their livelihood. And it is also similar situations in Southeast Asia and Indonesia. Indonesian land territory, it is 65% is categorized as state forest, and around 36% are located within and around the forest area. So the government provides several policy options to accommodate how to utilize the state for local livelihood. And it is the principle, it is forest area managed by the state, people's participation through social forestry arrangement. It is structured as fixed term permits to manage forests. It's around 35 years, and you can continue and under 5 different formal schemes, and emphasize on entrepreneurship and business development. There is no ownership rights. It is only utilization rights, except for customary forests or hutan adat or hutan rakyat, Indonesian call it. It is that legally outside the state forest, and it is mostly regulated and centralized in national level. And the question is, what happens if the principle of community-based forest management encounters social forestry? And let's learn a little bit the history, the journey of the social forestry in Indonesia. We have identified 4 generations at the moment. It is beginning in when a new order regime, it is authoritarian regime in Indonesia in 1970s until 1980s. The forest is mostly categorized as physical, slope, lands, or without social characters, without community input. And but at the moment, in this first generation, there is influence from global influence, the emergence of community-based natural resource management and participatory approach. And there is a milestone when World Forestry Congress in Indonesia in 1978 introduced the forest for people. This is the first beginning discussion and starting a demonstration plot for community forests in specific area in Java, for example, in Perhutani conservation area. In the second generations, it is turned to more, we call it era reformasi, democratic decentralization. A lot of civil society organizations advocate community rights, And the schemes piloted finally got the first formal licensed community forest in Lampung at the moment. However, still facing many challenges, limited land rights, tokenistic benefit sharing, and regulatory inconsistencies. And in the first period of Joko Widodo, it's more populist. They have a huge target of 12 million hectares under social forestry. It is the milestone because a new constitutional constitution recognized indigenous land rights. They use this milestone as well. But the challenge is the focus is only for meats, yeah, only about the quantity, not the quality of the social forestry. And now in 2024 until now, the new President Prabowo seemingly it is much enhancing their priority, the food security systems, legalization of illegal oil palm plantations, and then they want to integrate the social forestry into national food security programs. Yeah, this is the fourth generations. And yeah, so many, we are asking about where is the social in the social forestry. This is overly centralized, disconnected from undergrounds. Many locations with social forestry actually created but fail to be categorized as social forestry. Complete between schemes, especially hutan adat, customary forest versus village forest. A lot of discussions what schemes best for. And we have a chance to evaluate the social forestry in the 2020. Yeah, we make a census of all social forestry permits operating for at least 5 years. Yeah, and over 300 permits we analyze, and only around 15% that have clearly demonstrated positive impacts according to the government-owned criteria. Yeah. And interestingly, there are two types who have a good positive impacts. Those have a strong resistance, didn't strictly follow social forestry procedural rules. They make their own commoning, their own collective action to achieve success. And those that have strong facilitation from external actor, from NGOs or capacity building in the ground. Yeah. And I want to emphasize the first type, how the resistance become a model. Actually, we can learn visit two sites here. Yeah, the first is it is Ramang. This is was a remote hamlet beginning. It's very quiet, and then there is a mining marble company came, and a lot of resistance, a lot of demonstration, people resist this. And since 2009, and they build their collective strength and establish their local institutions, kick out the mining company. And after that, they transform this collective memory into a practice of commoning on tourism, yeah, making their own rules, retribution, river maintenance, traditional social sanctions, and after that they access social forestry. The social forestry as in the end, yeah. So they began with the resistance, and the second case, this is also in South Sulawesi. There are 14 HKM. HKM is hutan kemasyarakatan, one of the schemes social forestry, community forest. It is one landscape, but only two license permits here has very good success because they are not really following the rules. Yeah, for example, the 70%, you should plant 70% timber trees and 70% multi-purpose trees, and they don't do it. They make 30% this multi-purpose trees like a mango or 70% trees. Yeah, and then, for example, also the extension worker, yeah, because they are civil servant, they are not allowed to have plot there, but asking, and it will become a innovator of the local community, and then make their own plot, and then make a sample. Yeah, they make their own regulation. They make their own institutions framework. They say annual contribution from each member, for example, so they work collectively, and then they make this folder ban inside the area to tap in they began to breed livestock in the HKM area, began with a few members, mutual symbiosis between livestock and KCU trees at the moment, yeah. I just want to summarize that social forestry objective actually is to alleviate poverty, securing access to forest and forest land, improve condition of forest, including climate change mitigation and adaptation. But whose interest? Yeah, but whose interest serve? Governments here, community survival, probably getting rights recognized or saving the resources. Yeah, non-state actors, community development, empowerment, conservation, promoting these roles. But these groups are not homogeneous. Yeah, different type, different sites, different situation, and different actors. And what is the success? Sorry. Social forestry program evaluated based on entrepreneurship, development, and improvement in livelihood. Formal rules applied uniformly. State-owned the forest, community management, and local institution resistant adaptation. Local rules should be flexible and adaptive, and to become is a sense of ownership. Yeah. Limited definition of social forestry make this empower local people as replace the local practices, and so hones aspiration into predetermined priorities. Now a target of 20 million hectares of forest conserved is significant for climate change mitigation at national scale. But at local scale, adaptation and flexibility in rules of management are more important. Yeah. So we're asking about whose interests are actually served. I think that's all for now, and we can continue for the discussion.
Thank you very much. As you said, we'll continue with some questions, both from me and the moderator and the audience on this really interesting case studies that I think we'll take up in a few minutes. Our second speaker now is Enrique Nuñez, and from Conservation International, and I will let him take over and do his short presentation.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We'll load up my presentation.
Hello, can we get access to sharing our screen?
Luna, can you please share the screen?
Yes, I'm just waiting for the access. There. Okay.
Okay. Good day, everyone. Mahalo. I'm honored to be here today to discuss the indigenous-led nature-based solutions, building resilience in Southeast Asia. This webinar highlights a vital role of indigenous communities in conservation, climate action, and sustainable land management. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the indigenous communities whose lands and knowledge systems have long contributed to environmental stewardship. We will explore how their contributions remain essential in addressing climate change and biodiversity loss. By the end of the session, I hope to provide insights into how indigenous-led initiatives can shape climate resilience, conserve biodiversity, and how we can support their leadership in conservation efforts. Biodiversity is the foundation for human development, and many populations depend on available resources from forests, coastal and marine areas, and agro-ecosystems for food, fuel, timber, non-timber products, fisheries, and many more. All of us benefit from the ecosystem goods and services that nature provides. The circle represents two things. One, a large part of this circle comprises Southeast Asia and is considered to be a biodiversity hotspot. Second, there are more people living inside this circle than outside of it, and its numbers are projected to grow. Put together, Southeast Asia is one of the most biodiverse regions in the planet. Yet it is facing a severe crisis caused by rapid population growth. Climate change, habitat destruction, and resource exploitation also threaten these ecosystems. Without urgent action, millions of people, especially indigenous communities, will face food insecurity, economic instability, and environmental degradation. This is particularly concerning for rural and indigenous communities who are among the most vulnerable to climate change. They depend on biodiversity for traditional medicines, sustainable farming, and economic survival. At a larger scale, what is happening in Southeast Asia is part of a global crisis. About 1 million animal and plant species face extinction by 2030. $700 billion is needed. And this is the annual biodiversity funding gap, and this threatens conservation efforts. Biodiversity loss is not just an environmental issue, it threatens food security, livelihoods, and resilience against climate change. Therefore, we need to act together and get our acts together to address these crises. And ambitious actions are needed to commensurate with the scale of this crisis. Where I am from, in the Philippines, the government acknowledged that climate change is expected to be one of the most significant drivers of biodiversity loss in the Philippines. In 2020, a powerful super typhoon hit the Philippines, and it devastated many of the protected areas and pristine forests. And that is how climate change is also impacting our biodiversity. Next slide. The biodiversity and climate crisis highlight the urgency of sustainable community-led conservation efforts. Nature-based solutions remain relevant because it leverages natural processes to address climate change, biodiversity loss, and socioeconomic challenges by protecting, managing, and restoring ecosystems. Indigenous peoples play a crucial role in promoting nature-based solutions as they have been stewards of biodiversity for generations, and they have been protecting our biodiversity for millennia. They manage 25 to 30% of Asia's forests, which are critical carbon sinks, and their traditional knowledge and sustainable practices enhance our ecosystem resilience. Yet, despite their contributions, indigenous communities face major challenges such as land dispossession, resource exploitation, and exclusion from policy making. Recognizing and strengthening indigenous leadership in nature-based solutions is essential for lasting conservation success. Next slide, please. Indigenous communities across Southeast Asia have long practiced sustainable land and resource management and are implementing effective nature-based strategies. Some notable examples in the region, and this is one coming from the Dayak-led rainforest protection. It's a customary forest in Indonesia, which demonstrated that land rights are directly connected to preventing deforestation and maintaining carbon sink. The lady that you're seeing here in her national costume, in her indigenous costume, is Ibu Nurhayati, and she was with me when she presented her story about their customary forest in Kalimantan. In Vietnam, farmers practice agroforestry using indigenous knowledge of integrating trees with crops to restore soil health and biodiversity, ensuring sustainable food production. In Tonle Sap, where Conservation International has an existing program, this is in Cambodia, indigenous-led sustainable fisheries management balance conservation with livelihoods, demonstrating how traditional knowledge can align with modern conservation policies. In the Philippines, this is our story. Indigenous communities play a crucial role in preserving biodiversity. With 75% of remaining forests overlapping with indigenous lands, these indigenous communities ensure sustainability through traditional conservation methods. Programs like the Taloy Sur Watershed Conservation and the Mindoro Forest Biodiversity Program protect vital ecosystems while creating green jobs. In Palawan, and I think many of you are familiar with Palawan, communities safeguard the almasiga tree. And this is a tree where indigenous peoples collect resin. While in northern Palawan, in the islands of Coron, Tagbanwas manage marine resources. And And in this area, the first, and I think globally, the first ancestral waters title was given to the Tagmanwa people. And this refers to a legal document usually called the Certificate of Ancestral Domain Title, which officially recognizes their traditional rights to a specific marine area surrounding their ancestral land, allowing them to manage and protect their marine resources within their traditional waters. The UN Convention on Biological Diversity has long recognized the deep connection of indigenous peoples to nature and their traditional knowledge systems since the Rio Convention or the Rio Summit on the Convention of Biological Diversity in 1992. So it was initially recognized. However, there's little that has been done. This was further acknowledged and recognized in 2022 through the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, where indigenous stewardship now aligns with global conservation goals for 2050. Key targets include halting extinctions, restoring ecosystem, and ensuring resource use, and promoting sustainable or equitable benefit sharing. So what happened after that meeting in Montreal for the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Protocol? The UN Convention on, So since the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the Philippines developed its National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan called the Philippine Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. So it's commonly called NBSAPS. Civil society and a few indigenous peoples group participated in this process. This ensures that national policies align with the customary land governance and traditional ecological knowledge. However, it was not enough. A coalition of indigenous peoples organizations and support NGOs created the Indigenous Peoples Biodiversity Coalition. As a result, the Philippines' first Indigenous Peoples Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan was formulated, serving as a pioneering model for integrating indigenous governance into national biodiversity policies. The IPB-SAP perfectly aligns with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, recognizing the role of indigenous peoples in achieving the 2050 vision for biodiversity. Among the key aspects of the IPB-SAP is the formal participation of indigenous groups in policy making, ensuring that biodiversity strategies reflect indigenous priorities and contributions, recognition of indigenous land tenure as a fundamental pillar for biodiversity conservation, and third, the integration of indigenous knowledge systems and practices into national and local conservation strategies. So what happened then was the IPB-SAP was officially handed over to the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and it was for the first time integrated as a separate chapter in the Philippine Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. We have been producing the PB-SAP for some time now, but this is the first time where it was acknowledged officially by the government. The IPB-SAP offers a scalable model for other Southeast Asian nations still developing their biodiversity plans. Countries can adopt similar frameworks that, number one, secure indigenous land rights as a biodiversity strategy. Second, recognize and integrate traditional ecological knowledge. And third, ensure indigenous leadership and participation. The successful institutionalization of the IPB-SAP marks a critical moment for indigenous-led conservation, reinforcing that policies must move beyond consultation. So it's not just consultation, but a full recognition of indigenous governance system. The next step for this is to expand this approach regionally, and that is where the International Land Coalition is working. And we plan to have more learning events that will focus on this process and ensuring that the role of indigenous peoples is embedded in biodiversity targets across Southeast Asia. At COP16, and this happened in October of last year, the IPB-SAP was highlighted and it was launched as an example of indigenous leadership in biodiversity governance. This underscores the need for government to institutionalize indigenous stewardship in climate and biodiversity policies. The process now begins for localizing. So series of meetings have been conducted to localize and identify targets. And all of these targets from the localization process, and we have done so far about 4 target setting exercises, and this will be used to update the national database of indigenous community conservation areas. And this will add to the target that the government has set aside in meeting the goals of the KMGBF. So how then do we scale up indigenous-led nature-based solutions based on the cases that I have just presented? Number one, there's need to secure land tenure and customary rights as a foundation for NBS success. Second, there's need to strengthen indigenous governance and conservation planning. Third, there's need to blend traditional knowledge and science for resilient ecosystem. And fourth, we need to empower indigenous peoples and local communities in governance and decision-making. So to build a resilient, sustainable future, we must encourage government to fully recognize indigenous land rights and invest in indigenous-led conservation efforts. Second, ensure equitable access to climate finance and direct support for IP-led conservation. Third, we need to help integrate indigenous governance in NBS policies that the government will formulate and are formulating, and foster partnership between government, civil society, and indigenous peoples to scale up nature-based solution. By doing so, we can bridge the gap between policy and action, ensuring that indigenous knowledge and leadership remain at the core of conservation efforts. Lastly, in conclusion, indigenous peoples are not just stakeholders, and we have proven this when we developed the IPB-SAP. They are leaders and are stewards of biodiversity and climate resilience. Their knowledge, governance, and conservation practices must be central to environmental strategies in Southeast Asia. So I believe that we need to work together to support and amplify their contributions for a thriving, sustainable future. Thank you, and I look forward to our continued discussion.
Thank you, Ricky. That was for the presentation. I'm sure we'll enjoy discussing this more after our final speaker presents. Speaking of her, we'll move on to Yingshan Lau, who is now going to give us a talk on centering local communities in forest carbon governance. So I'll turn it over to Yingshan.
Just give me 1 second.
No problem.
Hello,
We're fine
everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm Yingshan. I'm from the National University of Singapore, and I'm part of this project called the Climate Governance of Nature-Based Carbon Sinks in Southeast Asia, or CGSEA for short. And today I'm going to talk about centering local communities in forest carbon governance. So I work with many collaborators in the Southeast Asian region, but primarily my area of focus is in the Lau PDR. I'm also observing developments in Vietnam and Indonesia and the Philippines. So my presentation today will mainly draw on materials from the Lau PDR. Okay. So as we all know, in 2015, there was the Paris Agreement, and it committed nations to limit climate change. And one of the key instruments under the Paris Agreement is Article 6, which kind of allows for the, you would say, like carbon trading or carbon offsetting. I would say one of the landmark, one of the key instruments would be in Article 6.2, where countries such as Singapore, where I am based now, can purchase carbon credits from another country in the region, such as Laos, to meet Singapore's own nationally determined contributions, climate change mitigation targets. And this instrument, Article 6, actually builds on a history of a long history of this idea of trading carbon credits, starting all the way from the early 2000s. In fact, in 1997 with the Kyoto Protocol, the clean development mechanism has allowed countries to develop countries to fund emissions reductions programs in developing countries, and in doing so claim the emissions reductions for themselves. Yeah. At the same time, on the right over here, I would say that this ambition of mitigating climate change has forced Southeast Asia as a region to think more regionally. For example, in ASEAN, we have the existing and planned ASEAN power grid. So I'm not an expert on this, but I do know that decision makers and governments are talking about like purchasing. For example, the Singapore government is talking about purchasing power through the ASEAN power grid from other countries like Thailand and Laos. But I would say that this brings us, this interconnectedness brings me to this concern about forests as carbon sinks. So as I mentioned earlier, we have things like the clean development mechanism that started all the way in 2000, and in 2003 it allows for afforestation and reforestation activities to be funded by developed countries to take place in developing countries. And in about the mid-2000s, we have the UN RED program. It was officially formalized in 2013. And all this while, it's this talk about how forests should be used for climate mitigation purposes. And it is a valid concern because, as you would see here, the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector would be the third largest sector that it would be the third largest sectoral emitter of greenhouse gases. But I also put up this figure to kind of emphasize that when we talk about forests, we're not just talking about forests that exist, but we are also talking about forests and land use, and that land use is very, very much tightly intertwined with forests, how much forest there are. Okay, so in Southeast Asia, we have some regional efforts to scale up the trading of carbon credits from nature-based solutions. We have on the left, we have this ASEAN Alliance on Carbon Markets. It was launched about 2 years ago by Indonesia. And on the right top here, we have this organization called Fair Atmos. Yeah, it has been promoting dialogue between various actors in the nature-based carbon trading space. And much of, I would say that on top of the CDM and on top of RED+, much of the impetus for nature-based carbon trading has been provided by the voluntary carbon market, which has evolved in parallel with RED+. So at the same time, we also have a regional effort that took place in November 2024. It was an exchange between Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, people working on forest carbon or nature-based carbon solutions. And it was an exchange on how to ensure social integrity of such projects. And it was very encouraging. I was very lucky to be able to observe this exchange, and it was very encouraging to see that there was such a project, there was such an exchange, because as we would have read in the media, there have been a lot of criticisms on how carbon projects have actually violated the rights of local communities and indigenous peoples. So I guess this is where some of my colleagues and myself, we have a particular interest in doing research upon. We are interested in how the social dimensions of forest carbon projects, particularly because forests should be seen as lived environments, as Pak Alif has presented, as Ricky has also presented also. I think in Southeast Asia, that there are many people. It's a dense region, and there's also a high forest cover. And in the past, there have been instances of forest conservation, but increasingly governments are recognizing that forest conservation does not work. So this picture on the left is actually a picture from the Northern Lao PDR, where the government has worked with the local community to zone some areas of forests as protection forests. But at the same time, they have to recognize, and in consultation with the local communities, they have to recognize that this, like there was a household that has been doing agriculture on this mountain slope for a long time. And in consultation with the household, the government recognized that, okay, the household is not willing to move away to allow this to become a forest. So then they respected it and kept it zoned as an agricultural land. Yeah. And on the picture of the right, on the right is a picture of a spiritual tree grove in a village in northern Laos. It's just showing how people and forests have been so closely interacting in Southeast Asia, as well as land use also. So land use is a huge consideration. So with more than, I would say with more than 15 years, more than 15 years of REDD+ implementation, I think researchers have come to agree on certain important social dimensions of forest carbon projects. On the right over here, there's a list of safeguards, 7 safeguards that were agreed in 2010. They are known as the Cancun safeguards, agreed at the UNFCCC. For effect, some of them talk about permanence and leakage, but others, another safeguard talks about full and effective participation and transparent processes. But I think we can kind of, as of today, we can kind of agree that there are kind of 4 main categories of safeguards, and then carbon projects can also be viewed as having social co-benefits. The co-benefits being linked to sustainable development goals. So for example, there's a forest carbon project help to promote gender equity. But I would say that the 4 main categories of safeguards would be free, prior, and informed consent. So this is a concept to do with effective and full participation of the relevant stakeholders, but it is a bit more stringent in the sense that it requires like stakeholders to decide freely, and that their consent is needed. Yeah. It is a concept that evolved from, I think, a lot of development conservation projects that worked with indigenous peoples in the past. Yeah. Another important safeguard is the grievance redress mechanisms. So if the affected community has something that they need to complain about, how do they do so? And is it like culturally appropriate? Do they even dare to use that grievance redress mechanisms, given that in some Southeast Asian contexts, the government is quite authoritarian? Yeah. The other safeguard is regarding tenure. So making sure that the forest carbon project does not affect the access, the local community's access to land and to forest resources. I think there have been certain cases, high-profile cases, in which some communities have not been actually, where their tenure rights have been violated. And increasingly, I think projects in the voluntary carbon space they are increasingly recognizing that if that is not respected, if tenure is not respected, then the project is bound to fail. Yeah. And then the last safeguard, or kind of, I think it verges between safeguard and benefits, is benefit sharing. So when you have a carbon project, the results-based payments from the carbon project is a monetary payment. And how is that being shared with all the stakeholders involved? Being local communities, the project implementers, governments, if they're involved at all. So how is this distributed, and what are the processes to ensure a fair and equitable benefit sharing process? So now I come to this curious concept of carbon rights, which is something that I'm still thinking about as a researcher. The idea of carbon rights, I would say, it was introduced as early as 2010 or even before by organizations such as WCOFT and probably even AIPP, Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. And back then it was saying that, you know, if carbon projects bring with them carbon revenues, who should take it? Who should have a right to the carbon revenues? And even more interestingly is like, besides the carbon revenues, is who has the right to claim the emissions reductions? So like, as we know, like the UN, because scientists need to keep track of how much countries are meeting their pledges, so countries also need to keep track. And so do country governments have the right to claim the emissions reductions for meeting their own climate change mitigation targets? Or can a local community say that, oh, I'm meeting my own climate change mitigation targets? Yeah, because fundamentally, for keeping track of emissions that then result in climate change, we do not want to double count. So like, we also don't want to double count the emissions reductions, because then scientifically it wouldn't be accurate. So like in Southeast Asia, I would say that governments have veered towards more of carbon rights as more of benefit sharing, whereas the governments retain the right to claim the emissions reductions. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But I just have this very interesting example of a project that was recently shared with me from another part of the world, where the project implementer, as part of the engagement process with the local stakeholders, had to explain the idea of what is carbon dioxide and what is the idea of a carbon credit. And in doing so, that was all fine, and the local community eventually understood the idea of carbon credit, and that it can be sold and that they can get money out of it. But what was really interesting is that once they understood, so the project developer said, okay, now this is a document for you to kind of like sign off your carbon rights to us, so that, I mean, I would say like it's a kind of a safeguard for the project developer itself, because then like it doesn't want to risk another project developer coming in to buy the emissions reductions from that local community. But I thought it was such an interesting example, because the idea of a carbon right was only created when the project developer approached the community and also presented the community with the document to sign. Yeah. Another debate also about carbon rights is whether it should be like who has the right to the emissions reductions and the carbon benefits or the carbon revenue. Is it a land-based, like because you live on, you have the tenure rights to that piece of land, so you should have a right to it? Or is it more activity-based because you help to plant the trees or take care of the trees, therefore you have the right to it? Yeah, so I would say that the idea of carbon rights is quite interesting, and it needs more thought over. But I also want to introduce this idea of enhancing carbon literacy, because I guess it's kind of stemming from the example that I gave from another part of the world, where the project developer came in and explained what carbon credits are, and then therefore created the idea of carbon rights. But to me, I suppose carbon, like, communities should be able to understand what this idea is even before they are approached by a project developer. Like, in an ideal world, governments should actually be having some kind of outreach or awareness raising program to explain to forest communities what are carbon markets and what are the associated risks, being like to their land tenure, risk of uneven benefit sharing, and then what is the idea of a carbon right. So on the left is a picture from an organization in Vietnam, which has undertaken the project of measuring forest carbon stocks within the forest, their forest preservation area. But what I would say is unique about this project is that one, it's not a project developer that is wanting to sell carbon credits or anything. It's just doing an assessment of forest carbon stocks. The other unique aspect is that it involved local communities, local stakeholders from around the region, as well as from around that area, and from other parts of Vietnam, that like farmers in the organization's network. And so it involved them, and it didn't involve them just as assistance to measure the tree girth and tree dimensions, but it also, in doing so, the project also tried to explain to them what what's the bigger picture background, that the country is moving towards domestic carbon trading, and how this may or may not affect their own lands and their forests, the community forest. So the last idea that I want to put out is that my whole presentation has talked about how forests are seen as carbon sinks and are managed and viewed as such. But actually, we should also think about, if forests are actually lived environments, then these people who are living with the forest, they are also experiencing the effects of climate change. So in this village where I went to in northern Laos last November, it was very interesting because we were talking about their observations of weather changes, and they kept on saying, a few interviews said that, in the past it was not so hot, the weather was cool, but now in the past few years we have to use a fan, and it's not because we don't have electricity, because of the perception that these villages are very remote, but actually they have electricity, but because it's become really hot, actually very, very hot. And I think this idea that forests are important for the people living inside, and that they have the function of regulating microclimate and regulating hydrology, it's also recognized by the Lao government, because in their poster of a REDD+ project, in communicating like what is REDD+ to the local community and why we should protect the forest, they emphasize that if you protect the forest, the water in the streams will come back, and like it'll be a greener environment. But I just want to leave us at this thought about, if forests are really lived environments, how can we also then think about helping the people who live with the forest to adapt to climate change? And yes, that's all from me. And I look forward to having an engaging discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Yingshan. That was very interesting. So that is our three presentations, and at this point, we're going to move into a moderated panel discussion. And I have a few questions for each of our panelists and presenters. So the first question will be to Pak Alif, and I wanted to ask that in your presentation, you highlighted the tension between formal social forestry schemes and a number of local practices. I wanted to ask you to describe how policymakers can better integrate local knowledge and everyday resistance into these formal frameworks to ensure more sustainable outcomes. I think this is a really important question, so I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this.
Yeah, as we present that sometimes governments it is much more have their own realm, yeah, different with the local community realities. So here, community, for example, government on produce policy regulations, even it is overdose, no, yeah, and then it is really incompatible with the local needs, and sometimes the local community needs a more flexible, more inclusive decision-making process, and including understand what is really the problem in the ground, yeah. So integrating this and then give them space to build their own definition, their own concept of social forestry. I think it will make this social forestry better, yeah.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had was based on the successful case studies that you've mentioned. What other lessons can we learn from Indonesia and from other Southeast Asian countries from Indonesia's experience with social forestry, and particularly addressing certain challenges such as tenure conflicts and overcoming bureaucratic hurdles?
Yeah, we can learn that we need more democratization of social forestry. Yeah, we make it more democratization of social forestry, ensuring this inclusive and involve local communities, flexible regulations, and especially the role of NGOs, yeah, the role of civil society is really. We have experience in Indonesia previously. It is need 30 tables, yeah, bureaucratic tables only to get one permit. Yeah, now they reduce it only 10 or 15 procedures. Yeah, so it is because of the advocacy, because of the long-standing advocacy of the social forestry, and and they also need more flexible regulation and dialogue.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Alif. A couple of questions that I have for Ricky, and first off, I wanted to ask you a question on the Philippine people's indigenous biodiversity strategy and action plan. I wanted to specifically ask you how this contributes to the goals of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity.
Well, yeah, that's a very, very good question, Brian. When we were developing the Indigenous Peoples Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, we had in mind the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Protocol framework. And in that framework, it's very, very clear that restoration targets have to be identified by the government, by the national government, and how will the indigenous peoples contribute towards the target. So when the plan was developed, all the 23 targets of the KMGBF were identified, and plans were also identified by the indigenous peoples and how they could contribute towards a target. And once the indigenous peoples have identified their targets, they presented this to the national government, and they told the national government to include these targets in the national government's target, because it's the national government that has to report this to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So for instance, if government has identified, let's say, 15,000 hectares of areas to be restored under Target 3 of the KMGBF, how much of the 15,000 will be indigenous lands? And indigenous lands are considered conservation areas, because indigenous peoples have identified indigenous community conserved areas, and this is also recognized by government. So that adds to the target. And all 23 targets have been identified by the indigenous peoples, and it's indicated here in this plan. It's all indicated here in this plan. It's a living document, and this is the first iteration. And this has been integrated in the Philippine Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I was also wondering how other Southeast Asian countries that are still developing their national biodiversity strategies can learn from the Philippine experience, and particularly with respect to integrating indigenous people's perspective into these efforts.
Yeah, I think that's another very good question. Towards late March, we will be holding an Asia Learning event, and we're organizing this together with UNDP. UNDP has an enabling activity. It's a global environment facility enabling activity on the NBSAPs, and they're encouraging governments to develop their national biodiversity strategy. So we will be holding this. We have invited countries from Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia, to participate in this event, and so that they could also learn from the experience of the Philippines on how we were able to integrate the perspectives of indigenous peoples in our national biodiversity strategy and action plan. We started this last year when we launched the IPBSAP, and the Philippines also launched its PBSAP during the Cali Conference of Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity. So it has already started. And in May of this year, this has also been recognized by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity, the ICBES. And there will be a workshop in May to identify how do we monitor, how do we evaluate success and impact of all of these targets. These particular targets have been identified by indigenous people. So that will happen in May this year. And we've invited also other countries to participate in that workshop.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you very much. A couple of questions for Yingshan as well from the moderator. First, you talked about a few drivers of deforestation and forest degradation, but I'm wondering if you could specifically talk about some other important larger scale drivers, things such as plantations and mining, and how do you think these issues and these activities should be addressed?
So so when I prepared my presentation, it's about centering local communities, but actually a large part of the debate about Trade Plus is that Trade Plus has actually kind of, what's the word for it? Kind of targeted local communities in terms of asking them to change their land use practices and ignoring larger drivers of deforestation like plantations, governments giving lands to commercial plantation companies, and then asking the commercial plantation company to find land themselves and therefore displacing local communities. That's a risk. And yeah, mining is also another huge driver of deforestation. And in that case, as I understand in Laos, it's more of a decision that's taken up at the what do you call that? At the national government level, and then so in a sense, the local communities, once a site has been selected for mining, then it kind of goes ahead. I think there's a project in Cambodia also that was a RED Plus project site, and then recently like because of some other infrastructure development needs, like I think it was hydropower or mining, then basically all the efforts put in for like working with the local communities on forest conservation in the past years, they were just like negated and cancelled. Yeah, so I feel that a lot of the RED Plus literature has kind of a lot of RED Plus program design and has kind of hooked on the idea on community forestry, which is all well and good, but a large part of the research has also shown that like the political economy of RED Plus has not really been sufficient. Like the financing has not been sufficient to address more lucrative projects like mining and commercial plantations. So in a sense, even though like RED Plus has been going on in Southeast Asia and around the world, there have been some studies that show that deforestation still persists. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just following up from that a little, maybe if you could talk about some of the challenges and opportunities from RED Plus implementation in the past few years.
Okay, so RED Plus is a program, it's a UN program, right? And it was envisioned to have 3 stages. One is the readiness phase, one is the I think the project design phase, and then one is the implementation phase. I think yeah, what I've seen in Laos is that you know, RED Plus has definitely helped to build capacity in terms of enabling a country that has very little funds for forest protection to build capacity to use remote sensing to monitor for forest clearance and forest fires. So it has definitely helped to build capacity. I think another front that RED Plus has provided opportunities for is on the issue of tenure. Because of Southeast Asia's history, tenure is very contested by like there are claims by local communities and by governments, and these claims to land overlap. What I think the lessons from forest carbon projects and RED Plus have shown is that if you don't get tenure right, then you can't have a successful project. And it has, in a sense, because people are recognizing that, it has also provided an opportunity for groups in various parts of Southeast Asia to kind of raise this issue of tenure again. However, I would say that there are still many challenges, and one challenge is in like governmental coordination. So is RED Plus a forestry project, or is it a land use project, or is it a national government project, for example? And what we have seen from studies is that during the readiness stage, RED Plus may be elevated as a national priority, but then, you know, as it then takes shape and form, then it gets relegated back to the forestry department. And then because it's no longer a national priority, other interests like mining would then be attractive to the decision makers in the government. So I think that's one challenge. Another challenge would be the issue of elite capture that is prevalent in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world also, where you know, like people of influence, they capture the benefits, and then as a result, the benefits are not evenly spread amongst the people.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'll stop dominating the questioning here, and we'll turn things over to our audience now. and their questions. And if anyone in the audience would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A box to type in your questions, and we'll have the panel attempt to address those. So our first question is from an audience participant who thanks everyone for the presentations. And the question is about to Mr. Nuñez about integration of Philippines IPBSAP into the government's plan and how to scale that around the region. What conditions are needed for this to happen? And how did the IP groups create pressure such that the government wanted their formal input?
Yeah, thank you. I think I've partly answered that question, but the perfect condition that is there among all the countries in Southeast Asia is that each country has to develop their own national biodiversity strategy and action plan. I think Indonesia will have to develop theirs, Thailand, and many other countries. And that is the perfect condition for you to bring to that discussion, to the table, the aspirations of the indigenous peoples. And you need to organize that. And that is, and aside from that, there are other national planning processes that that your government could take on, and even civil society could take on to bring that that discussion forward.
Okay, thank you for that. I think the next question, and we can see who would like to answer this. I think this one is to Pak Alif and also to Enrique. The audience member was asking, I was wondering if you can speak about the resilience of customary laws and indigenous governance over time in securing land rights and forest resources for the future. How resilient are customary laws and practices in the past compared to what they are today, particularly in times where there's an increasing demand for lands for economic development and increasing interests by authorities in formalizing land and property laws? So I think, Pak Alif, you were going to address this question.
Thank you very much, Pak Ariel, for the questions. The resilience of customary laws and indigenous governance in securing land rights and forest resources vary significantly depending on the location and the specific indigenous entity. In some cases, formalization of customary rights has strengthened communities' ability to protect their resources and resist external pressures, such, for example, Indonesia, such as from large palm oil companies, for example. And the recognition of indigenous forests, hutan adat Indonesia has empowered certain communities to legally defend their territories and sustainably manage their resources. However, formalization also sometimes can also have unintended consequences. In some instances, it has led to elite capture, where benefits formal recognition are monopolized by indigenous elite, leaving marginalized members of the community excluded. Because sometimes in some places it is still feudal. They still have feudal structures. Not all indigenous laws are inherently inclusive. Some can be highly feudal, reinforce existing power imbalances. So this should be the highlights important to see, listening the silence voices, those who are unheard in the process. It should during the formalizations or to ensure that formalization truly benefits the entire communities. So this is a challenging. Another challenging as well is the perception of indigenous movement, that there is up to a tendency of romanticizing indigenous system as relics of the past. It is portraying them as static or idealized versions of history. So while indigenous governance have these historical roots, it's not immune to modern challenges such as internal inequality, external economic pressures, and so on. So I think I hope it's answered.
Thank you. I think Ricky or Yingshan, did you want to jump in on this question as well?
Add to that.
Okay.
If I may add, I completely agree with what Dr. Alif just mentioned, but I think we're all aware that indigenous communities, they use cell phones, they use Google Maps, and this cannot be stopped. it's happening. But I think what is important is indigenous leaders in the Philippines are aware of all of these things that are happening, and they're taking steps. They're taking steps to make sure that their indigenous territories are well protected, and they've been advocating this with government by getting their indigenous lands recognized, and so that starts there, and many indigenous peoples in the Philippines, as an example, have started developing a school for living traditions so that the youth can get more involved in customary governance. I do agree that we should not glorify the indigenous peoples as static communities, but they also do recognize this. So there's that move towards creating more schools of living traditions. In one of the successful conservation areas that is being led by indigenous peoples, they have established a youth organization to bring to train the current youth on indigenous governance, because they have been so used with social media and all that. So that is being undertaken. In Canada, I've read one case where a carbon project was able to provide the indigenous peoples through the money they got from carbon to develop a communal house, and that brought back the spirit of community again for the local community. So you have that happening at the same time. So as I said earlier, how do we scale this up? So we need to blend traditional knowledge and science, and that is really very, very important, and that is still happening right now. Thank you.
Any other inputs, Yingshan, on this one, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to add in also that, like, there is a risk of over romanticizing indigenous peoples and local communities' roles, and definitely I forgot to add also when you asked the question about drivers of deforestation. One of the other drivers of deforestation is forest clearance for cash cropping by the local communities themselves. So we see this as a problem, and it seems like the results-based payments that come after a few years in the design of forest carbon projects, they are not very they don't meet the immediate needs of local communities. But I would say that, yeah, I think that at least from my observations in Laos, I would say that there needs to be more environmental education at the youth level and at the primary school level for the local communities. So I use local communities in the context of Laos because the word indigenous, like, it's not officially recognized. But yeah, so the local communities can know, what are the wonders of the forest and what are the ecosystem services that the forest provides. Because we also notice increasingly more and more people are not going into the forest to collect non-timber forest products because they are more connected to markets, which is also kind of what they want, and we cannot deny it. But yeah, I think there needs to be more effort on environmental education at the young age.
Okay, thank you. Our next question from the audience relates to how the performance of social forestry schemes in Indonesia is achieving the objectives presented earlier.
Yeah, as I presented earlier, that we have a chance request by Ministry of Forestry itself to make us to evaluate this in 2020, and 80% is for us is fail. Yeah, we used their own category because a lot of logic. For example, for example, the government give the area that already forested area, and they are not allowed to cut the tree. They are not allowed to burn because they have traditional system for the shifting cultivation, for example, system, and they are not allowed to do this. And yeah, we cannot and a lot of problems. So the logic between the government and the local situation is also, sometimes it is different. So only two types that have, and it is only 15 or 20% get this. Yeah, it is because of they are not following, they resist, they do their own institutions, but silently, not telling the government, because and those that have facilitations from, for example, NGOs or donors, something like that. Yeah.
Any other input on that question? Okay, we'll move on to our next question, which are directed to Yingshan, and the thanks from the audience for your presentations. The first part is, across Southeast Asia, does voluntary carbon markets have equivalent safeguards and co-benefit social dimensions to REDD+? Obviously, VCMs have their own methods and regulations, but I'm curious if you see whether their rules are up to par with the safeguards of REDD+. We'll deal with that one first.
Okay, so thank you for your question. That's not an easy question to answer. So when you talk about REDD+, I guess you're referring to the UN REDD+ program. Yeah, so on the VCM, there are different standards. There's standards ranging from the voluntary carbon standard under RERA to the gold standard to the CCB standard, climate and biodiversity standard, and then also plan revolt. And I would say that they're all kind of designed differently. So I would say that some standards are more strict on the safeguards and co-benefits aspect. Yeah, like some standards actually require full free, prior and informed consent, but some standards just say participation or consultation. Yeah, so it ranges. And comparing with REDD+, actually, because REDD+ is more like the UN REDD+ is more a government program. I would say that what REDD+ did back in 2010 with the Cancun safeguards is to like set the framework, and that set of 7 Cancun safeguards is actually not as stringent as some of the more stringent voluntary carbon standards. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on that point? Okay, at this point, we're nearing the end of our webinar, so I'd encourage you, if you have any additional questions, to please add them into the Q&A box right now. The second part of that question directed toward you, Yingshan, was, do you see examples how carbon rights as a new legal regime potentially have complicated or shifted authority over land use, ownership, and access across communities in Southeast Asia?
Yeah. So the country that I focus on most is on the Lau PDR, and in the Lau PDR, they have just released a carbon decree. I think governments are recognizing that you need to have a proper framework, like a registry, to actually keep track of what's going on, and like not and to avoid double counting of emissions reductions, and that's very important for accounting at the UN level. I don't see the idea of carbon rights per se. Like I would say that, like, at least in the Lau PDR, it's viewed more as the government does the accounting, and then the benefits are shared with the local communities, at least for right now, because most of the REDD+ projects there are government-led. But the government is also considering how to invite more private sector investment, and the concerns with these private sector investments are more to do with the history in where there has been cases of land dispossession from the by the private sector. Yeah, so it may complicate things. We are still following the developments.
Yeah, thank you, Yingshan. Anyone else want to jump in on those points?
I can
Okay.
add
Oh, sure. Sorry, Enrique.
Yeah,
Please
for
go ahead.
carbon rights in the Philippines, I think this is something that is still being undertaken by the government. One important element for carbon rights, and this is a new policy that is about to be released soon. The National Commission on Indigenous Peoples came out with a FPIC policy for carbon development projects. So it will be a requirement for all carbon projects to undergo an FPIC process. So that's an important element. In terms of carbon trading policy, Article 6, this is something that we have been pushing the Philippine government to be very, very clear about, and of course, be very, very clear about carbon rights. So that's something that we will be seeing in the coming months ahead.
All right. Anyone else? Our final question is, and I'm very happy this question was contributed because it was something I've been thinking of while I've been listening to the presentations and the discussion, is that considering the current state of social forestry programs, what are prevailing research trends that can genuinely contribute to success rather than just adding more publications, or on the government side, adding towards more policy? Are there some emerging research focus in policy, community empowerment, ecological aspects, or that can have a tangible impact on the ground? And I'll open this up to all three of you.
Yeah, the traditional research is always like the one question, yeah, the research and the users it is separated. Yeah, so there should be a research integrating to the use. A lot of actually good research, but not really integrated, not really heard, not really a lot of criticizing this program, but still government produce the same things. Yeah, so it should be in the two, both sides should change. Yeah, for example, in the local level, in the community, they should take lesson from these several sites that you should resist. You should make your own. In the government, you should make adaptive policy frameworks. Yeah, really listening, really harmonizing laws, make capacity building. And for the researcher, probably needs much more, for example, action research, participatory action research to get a little bit impact. Yeah, not become a hero, but really at least communicating research in the ground.
Anyone else like to jump in on that question?
I agree with Alif that participatory research approaches are very much important. For researchers to go into the field, I always feel that there is, when you create a relationship with your interviewee, it's a two-way dialogue, and then it allows the researcher to share like the latest information with the interviewee. So I think, yeah, definitely participatory research should be incorporated. Another point I would like to add to answer Sally's question is, I think when we talk about free, prior, and informed consent, there is so the context is like in carbon projects, right? There's this ideal requirement of FPIC, but then as I read from one paper, the paper was asking, so what exactly does FPIC entail? Because at the moment, like benefit sharing, you can document it on a piece of paper, whether respects tenure rights, it's also possible to document, but FPIC is a process. So it's kind of difficult to document that process. And that paper was suggesting that, like, because of this, then there's a lot of argument in the practitioner space that, or the critiques of the practitioners is like, oh, we're not doing FPIC well, that's terrible, that's not free, that's not prior, that's not informed consent also. So basically the paper was suggesting like, oh, what is what is acceptable level of FPIC? Yeah, or what is the minimum requirement? Can that be more spelled out more clearly to guide practitioners? Yeah.
Thank you, Yingshan. Yeah, I was going straight to you, Enrique, because of your experience in this area over 25 years, where we should go.
Well, I think it is important to monitor whether social forestry in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia in general, even indigenous conservation practices are creating the impact to address a biodiversity crisis. And I think we need to measure those. And that is something that we need to see and provide information on. I think the IPBES right now is taking the right direction in trying to come up with tools to measure all of these impacts and whether all of these targets are all addressing the crisis. Because we have a lot of plans, that's true. There's too many plans. Even in the Philippines, it's just too many plans, but we don't even know whether these plans are being implemented, whether there are sufficient tools to really engage communities to do their own monitoring of all of these impacts.
Okay, great. Thank you, Enrique. Okay, that's the end of our audience Q&A session, and we're nearing the end of our webinar. And I think before our host, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies Associate Director, Dr. Terry Skillman, does a formal closing of this webinar, I've been asked to just sum things up a little bit. So over the past hour and a half, we've had 3 really wonderful presentations and a Q&A session. And Pak Alif talked to us about social forestry, community-based natural resource management, collective action, and he described some successes at several sites in Indonesia and discussed how this success was either self-directed and local in terms of the initiatives or strongly supported with formal frameworks and outside support. And Mr. Nuñez talked about localizing global and national objectives and how nature-based solutions are needed to protect biodiversity and how indigenous peoples play a really critical role in protecting biodiversity. And then Yingshan discussed regional initiatives that are needed to address climate change in ASEAN and a couple of local efforts in Laos and how these carbon right issues may be dealt with. Just following on from the final question and trying to sum all of this up, I think it's clear that we've had a lot of global and national initiatives at the policy level and at the strategic level. We've also had a lot of local action, some of it successful, some of it not successful. And in terms of how to proceed, I really think we need to start to bring the global, national, and local together more effectively. And in some sense, I really think a regional organization like ASEAN plays a really important role in this in terms of bringing national and local stakeholders together in a regional sense. And I think ASEAN as an organization, as a concept, really has a lot to offer, and I think can provide some really important lessons globally in terms of regional cooperation on these issues. So that's my sum up for the webinar. I want to thank our presenters who did a fantastic job today and the audience for their questions. And I'll turn it over to Terry Skillman right now to close the session. Oh, I think you're muted, Terry.
And here I thought I had unmuted myself. So mahalo, Dr. Szuster, for moderating the panel today. And mahalo to Dr. Lau, Dr. Nuñez, and Dr. Alif for your very engaging information and discussion on environmental innovation and sustainability in Southeast Asia. We really appreciate your time and your willingness to share your knowledge with us. Thank you to everyone who attended today's webinar. Please add April 2nd. Hawaii time is 3 o'clock, the same as today, to your calendars for the third LuceSEA webinar entitled Promoting Community-Centric Economy in Southeast Asia. There are important links in the chat for today's webinar. The survey is there. The YouTube link for this recording will be up once we clean up the transcription to make it easily readable in English. And also CSES website and media platform links. Please do sign up for our newsletters and engage with us on all of our social media platforms. Mahalo nui for joining us today. Be well, and we hope to see you again. Aloha.
Aloha.